What is up, race fans? We are returning to the Daytona Superspeedway where it all began. Because what can be more synonymous than Daytona and speed? It's the Daytona Firecracker 400. The top 11 cars in the points are guaranteed a spot in the race because one of the cars in the top 12 is Pete Hamilton's car. The chassis pushed itself up into the body when he corrected in qualifying last week. And because of that, he's expected to miss the rest of the season. But don't worry, he'll be back in some capacity or the other as soon as the mail-in series is done. And we'll start off with our points leader, Ross Chastain. He had his first bad race since the Daytona 500 and looks pretty sluggish coming out of turn 2. That's a 10:31. Must still be sore from his wreck on the opening lap. Up next is Sterling Marlin. Gained a lot of points on him by finishing second last week. If you remember, he actually crashed in qualifying for the Daytona 500 when he had no points, and that's a 9:07. He's not going to miss this one. Up next is Jimmy, starting a little bit of a resurgence after breaking his streak of DNFs. So far, Jimmy looks pretty fast. Heading into turn 1, he has not hit the wall at all, and that's a 9:31. Up next is Alan Kulwicki, your Bristol winner. He's been a model of consistency, hasn't had a DNF in the segment racing all year. As he comes out of the split track and heads onto the fat track, he loses a lot of speed in the corner. That's a 9:66. He may be getting in on points. Up next is Todd Bodine, one of our hard luck drivers. Other than that win at Charlotte, he's had a lot of crashes caused by other drivers, last lap crashes while leading. Right now, he's on the pole at 8:40. Up next is Johnny Benson, our highest-ranking rubber tire car, as well as our highest-ranking car that hasn't won a race yet. And he got some wild pushback from the gate, but that hasn't affected him at all. He just shot out of there, and right now, that's a 7:38, a full second faster than Bodine. That'll be really hard to beat for the pole. Up next is Kaz Grala, one of our surprise drivers. He's certainly not an underdog anymore. He's been to 3 straight main events. Top 10 in points, and that's an 8:34. Up next is Bill Elliott. Probably the unluckiest driver in the series. 2 different castings and front row starts almost every week, and he usually ends up on his roof. That's an 8:72. Up next is Richard Petty. Made it to the main event last week. First time since the 500, and maybe his season will start turning around. But not at this rate. He'll be in on points. It's a 9.56. Not very impressive. And up next is Ricky Craven, our other driver with rubber tires. One of 2 that are left in the series because David Reagan's disqualified for the season. And Craven is on a downward spiral. It's like the 4th race in a row he's in on points. That's a 10 flat. This is Johnson Jr., our first viewer commissioned car. One of my coworkers wanted a red number 11 a car. I obliged, and it won the race last week. And thankfully that win put him in the top 11 in points because that's a 10.25. He really needed those points. And up next is Bubba Wallace, currently sitting at number 13 in points. One of the casualties of these late bloomer drivers getting wins, but that doesn't matter. He's in the show. That's a 7.93. And now for Rusty Wallace. After David Green borrowed his car last week, he's back in his own car, so Rusty's going to qualify it, and he's not going to get in. That's a 10.53. He'll need a miracle. Up next is Jeremy Mayfield. He's been lightning fast but frustratingly inconsistent this year. And he shoots out of there really fast and just flies into the turn and turfs it. He's not going to be racing today. Up next is E. Marshall. At one point he was just a point or 2 out of the top 12, but some rough driving, some DNFs, some DNQs later, and he's going to need a miracle to get in here at 10.56. And up next is Jeff Fuller. So far this year, he's been a consistently mid-pack driver. He's been qualifying for races on speed, despite not being in the top 12 in points since like week 3 or week 4. Usually ends up in the thirds race or the back half of the seconds race, and that's a Pretty decent 9.37. Up next is Martin Truex Jr. He's only attempted the super speedways of the year, but when he showed up, he's been pretty quick. Let's see what he's got here. Not much pushback from the track. And he looks pretty fast coming out of the gate, and that is an 850. An 850 flat. That should put him towards the front. Up next is D Driver. D stands for don't know why he's still here. He's not been as successful as his teammates Jimmy or Bubba Wallace, and that was bad. That was almost 10 seconds. I don't think he's going to get in. Up next is David Green. He drove Rusty Wallace's slower casting into a top 10 finish last week. Let's see what he's got today, and that is a 750. He is angry about the race official's error last week, and he's putting on a show. That's good for second place right now. Up next is Ricky Rudd. Same casting as Kaz Grala. Let's see if he can turn his luck around this season too. Ricky Rudd's looking good. That's an 843. That should get him in. Up next is Ryan Blaney. Similar casting to Martin Truex Jr. so far has been much slower. He hasn't raced in a while, I don't believe so, and doesn't look that bad coming into the turn, but goes pretty high, loses a lot of time. That's a 9.9. Not good at all. And up next is Jeff Gordon. We haven't seen him in a race since week 3 when we traveled to France, and I don't think we're going to see him today. He's losing a lot of momentum coming out of the turns. That's an 11.4. That is definitely not going to get him in. Up next, we have Elmo Langley. Made it into the seconds race last week, his first appearance after a while, and he's had some rear end problems in the seconds race, and that's continuing today. They swapped the differential on it, but the car's still hopping up and down the track. That's a 10.97. He might want to take that differential back to the store for a refund because it didn't work for him. Up next is Swervin Irvan, having kind of a late season renaissance after his first car got disqualified early in the season. And that's a 9.34. That should get him in the show. And now we have everybody's favorite party animal, Vinny Nightlife, flying back and forth between here and Australia. Doesn't seem to bother him at all. He's looking really fast today. That's a 9.44. And up next is Bobby Labonte, another driver we haven't seen in a really long time. And this may be his last shot before we park him if he doesn't get in. But you know what happens whenever I say that? He ends up getting in anyway, and that's a 9.75. And he will get in because this is our last driver. This is Matt Kenseth, and Matt Kenseth has to beat a 9.78. That's D driver, dangerous driver, in order to get in the show. So it's one dangerous driver versus another. And that is a 9.28. And that lap is good enough for 10th. As you can see in the starting lineup, Johnny Benson's on the pole. David Green, Bubba Wallace, Kaz Grala are your other front row starters. Bobby Labonte's in the race for the first time in what seems like forever. Only 3 drivers got in on points, which are Ricky Craven, Johnson Jr., last week's winner, and our points leader, Ross Chastain. You may ask why he's starting last. And that's because none of them DNF'd during their qualifying laps. Even though they have guaranteed spots, they still are being sorted by their speed because none of them DNF'd. In fact, we only had 1 qualifying DNF throughout the whole session. That's very impressive considering how top-heavy some of these castings are. And as always, let me know who you think is going to win in the comments section. If you guess correctly, you'll be sent a Hot Wheels car at the end of the season. And as always, leave a like and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We'll see you guys on the track.